This is the main thing that makes me want to go to Tokyo now.
The sex room hotel?
Not the sex hotel, just the architecture.
Oh,
just
okay.
that we have things like...
I thought we were going to learn something interesting about Captain Logan.
It's not... Well, you know, the space room does look really cool. The following is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before watching this review. Hugh Jackman, until he made Logan, popularly lamented never quite doing what he wanted with Wolverine on the big screen, especially in the solo Wolverine films. When he made Origins, the story he really wished he could be part of telling was the one James Mangold is telling here, or at least a story in this setting and based on Frank Miller and Chris Claremont's 1982 miniseries. We all know how hackneyed and out of left field Origins was. It's a messy, convoluted origin that doesn't line up with what we were given before, misses what makes Wolverine interesting and compelling, and spends a lot of time telling us about how difficult it is for Logan to keep his savage inner animal at bay without actually delivering that conflict to us on the screen. And before that, with X-Men The Last Stand, we had the last in a trilogy of films that eclipsed the other potentially interesting, but mostly less than three-dimensional protagonist with Wolverine, who, by that point, was overpowered and already wearing thin. Jackman put his heart and soul into every performance, but sorry to say, not every director and writer who got their hands on him seemed to be the best at what they did, and what they did to Wolverine and the X-Men franchise wasn't very nice. With X-Men First Class, Matthew Vaughn proved that the X-Men films could stand just fine on their own without the presence of Wolverine, and the character suddenly found himself in the unlikely and precarious position of having to prove his worth again to a big screen audience. I say this with hindsight, but by now, the Wolverine feels as much about getting the shit back on course for the character as it is about finally getting it right. This isn't the be-all, end-all Wolverine movie, and it didn't feel that way to me even when it was first released, 4 years before the same director, James Mangold, made his follow-up, but not a direct sequel, in Logan. I thought it was a thoughtful character study for Logan and did an excellent job of reminding me what's so special about this character besides sharp claws and the undeniably compelling actor playing him. But it left me wanting more, and looking back on it, that's not a criticism. When Logan gets on that plane with Yuriko at the end, ready to rejoin the world as a soldier and hero again, the movie seems to say, we're just getting warmed up. As surprising as it was when it was first announced that this movie would finally, after 6 years, be the first story in this continuity set post The Last Stand, it's entirely appropriate and I think even a little classy. It acknowledges some of the mistakes that were made with the last 2 movies Wolverine appeared in and tackles them head on, especially the fact that he had gotten so powerful that nothing could really challenge him anymore, at least physically, and that for the central protagonist of 4 X-Men movies in a row, audiences really didn't have enough of a sense of what it was really like to be Wolverine. So Mangold made a movie about how Logan feels about what we've seen him do, who he is, and the curse of immortality that comes with that godlike status he developed over those films. The Wolverine is a character-defining film. It's almost a proof of concept. You know, intellectually, who this guy is supposed to be, but we hadn't actually focused on the chemical makeup of the man, rather than the mythology and mystery surrounding how he got the metal claws. It's a Baptist tent revival, an event designed for reaffirmation and newfound commitment. And the journey the film itself is taking parallels Logan's own reaffirmation of his ideals and his sense of duty. The film redefines Logan, or I should say, defines him again, and promises its audience that it will capture and, moving forward, continue to capture the spirit of the character from the comics with the sort of reverence and care Richard Donner took with Superman. And on that, I think the movie absolutely delivers. I'm sure I'll bring this up again when I get to Logan, but the Wolverine trilogy is an odd one because it isn't a true trilogy at all. Not only is it not telling a single story in 3 movie-length acts, or even continuing to further ideas and story threads from one standalone movie to another, like Nolan's Batman movies, but it's 3 films all in the same continuity, yet none of them really informs the previous except thematically, and they all take place in different time periods with an inordinate amount of time in between each. Origins Origins has been all but retconned by this point, and the X-Men franchise is soft rebooted within continuity by the time Logan happens, which is apparently in the post-Days of Future Past timeline, but I have to look at it as its own world with similarities to the X-Men movies of old, or my brain explodes. We have a set of 3 movies here, all starring the same actor, playing the same role, in the same world, but they all exist as completely separate pieces. I imagine an 8-year-old kid discovering Wolverine for the first time and watching all 3, expecting one continuous story like Star Wars, and then being totally befuddled by the time he gets to this one, and then having nightmares for a week and needing to see a therapist after he sees Logan. You know, assuming he even got past Origins. Oh, and don't show your 8-year-olds Logan, folks. These are spin-offs of a larger franchise, and that's partly why this phenomenon happens, but I don't know of another group of films that's quite like this. Certainly not in such a mythology-heavy universe. It's like looking at 3 graphic novels about the same character, each with a strikingly different tone, and arguably each working in a slightly different genre. What's impressive, of course, is that it's totally intentional with the last 2, and the same guy made them both. It's impossible for me now not to look at the Wolverine as the warm-up for the main event. And again, that's not a strike against it. I think Mangold is intentionally trying to whet our palate for more of this take on the character. We need to rediscover Logan as he rediscovers himself before we'll be any more ready than he is for his next 2 adventures. Sure, he's making a singular piece, and this story works perfectly fine on its own, so if Mangold hadn't gotten to make another one, he would have been perfectly happy and proud of what he had here, and he would have achieved quite a lot with the character. But the arc Wolverine goes through here is essential for his unlikely role in Days of Future Past, as guide to his own mentor in the past to make sure he becomes the man Logan and so many other mutants will need him to be in the future. Yoshida calls Wolverine a Ronin, a samurai without a master. He was lost and without purpose before he met Professor Xavier, and he not only loses Jean in The Last Stand, but he loses his mentor, his master. So he has to relearn his purpose again before he can save his master, who he'll be caring for like a son, taking care of his senile, ailing father in Logan. What's so essential about the Wolverine is that it does all that legwork that should have been done before Wolverine was put in that leadership position in The Last Stand. And we see the animal he thinks he has to always keep at bay, but which is an important part of who he is, if only he can control it and not be controlled by it, which I didn't see come alive in Origins. The Wolverine isn't the ultra-stylized, pulpy piece I would have expected going into this material, and I was initially disappointed that Mangold didn't even attempt to bring that look and atmosphere to this piece. But that wouldn't have been appropriate for the story he's telling, which is a grounded and intimate character study, influenced heavily, he says, by westerns like 3:10 to Yuma, which is partly about a guy like Logan trying to decide if he has a duty to try to stop bad people doing bad things when the odds are more than stacked against him, and it'll probably only end in tears. A wildly heightened Samurai Jack-esque aesthetic might have taken Logan too far outside of the context of the world we're already familiar with, that he's inhabited for several other movies. That's not to say there isn't plenty of style and atmosphere here, but it doesn't approach a Sin City level of unreality I might have hoped for before seeing what the film was trying to accomplish. Importantly, Wolverine himself feels like he's in a world that unreal when he first lands in Japan, and Mangold is brilliant at making Japanese culture and tradition feel like it's from a whole other planet for him. Like landing on Mars, as Mangold uses as an amusing metaphor for Logan's experience in the Love Hotel, which is, honestly, the main reason I want to go to Japan now. This movie really captured my imagination with its depiction of Japan, but specifically with the sex hotel. It's on my bucket list to go to one of those and see if they have a Velociraptor room. Actually, scratch that, it's my only reason for living now. This is A Stranger in a Strange Land story about a man who's lost in his comfortable wilderness with no reason to live and has to be taken completely out of his comfort zone, see the world through an entirely new perspective before he can come full circle and be the man he knew deep down he was all along. As discussed with the featurettes, Mangold is as much a writer as he is a director. He puts the story first, and that shines through this material. Although the movie does start to fall into the typical trappings of the genre by the end, kidnapped girlfriend, copious amounts of villain posturing and speechifying, big fight with a monster or a guy in a mech robot suit, its action serves its story and is driven by choices characters make, rather than a series of action set pieces that move the characters along, like they're playing a game of mousetrap. It's a tight, polished script, and Mangold has an excellent command of storytelling. Every scene and line matters, and he expertly employs the visual medium to communicate events and ideas through the action as much as possible. It's nice to have the line, "nothing is without meaning," from Mariko in a movie where that's true in the narrative. The approach Mangold takes to how he tells his story is reflective of the culture of the place Logan has dropped into. The writing is relatively minimal, but not to the point where I'm confused about character motivation or what's happening, like I often was with Man of Steel. Logan isn't a chatty character, but I always know what he's feeling and why he's making the choices he's making. This is one of the best examples of a movie that gives its audience credit and allows us to connect the dots for ourselves, but also, for the most part, gives us enough to go on. I would go as far as to say that a lot of this works as a silent film. If you watch this movie on mute, you'd get the gist of what's happening and nearly all of the thematic ideas. You need the spoken exposition for some of the secondary character motivations, like the sniveling Minister of Justice and his plan to kill his own fiancée. But so much of the crux of the film is in the imagery and the action. In the flashback at the beginning at Nagasaki, Yoshida never says he's afraid to die. That's evident in his actions, when he hesitates to fall on his sword like his fellow soldiers rather than be taken by the bomb. Logan doesn't have to say he feels like a wounded animal that needs to be put down. He obviously relates to the bear at the beginning who is physically in that predicament. Logan never has to verbalize how much he cares for Mariko. Time and again, he puts his own life in jeopardy to protect her from the Yakuza, even when his healing factor is on the fritz and he goes through hell to get to her in the third act when she's held captive by Viper. The one place where Mangold takes this too far is with some of the fully Japanese exchanges. There are a few scenes where characters speak to each other in Japanese, often to conceal what they're saying from Logan, and unconventionally, were not given English subtitles. I have a lot of respect for that choice when Logan is in the room. Our protagonist doesn't know what's being said, and so neither do we, unless, of course, you speak Japanese. And that works if we can infer enough from what's being said by the way it's being said. But there are scenes where Logan isn't there, like the exchange with Mariko and her father just before she gets kidnapped, where we're party to a private conversation filled with vital information about a character motivation, and I am completely clueless because we don't get to know what actual words are said. This is not a case of gleaning everything we need from a visual context. This particular exchange is a standard bad guy proving how crazy he is with twisted logic scene. Mariko's father, Shinjin, expresses his jealousy for his own daughter because she apparently has more in common with Yasuda, his father and the most powerful man in Japan, than he does. He puts this in genetic terms, and it's really interesting. He says he studied biology in college, and he talks about regressive genes, not that you really need an extensive education in genetics to know about regressive genes, and says that some traits skip a generation, like eyes and hair, and then he says talent, temperament. He's angry that his father decided to give his daughter his multi-gajillion-dollar company at his death instead of him. Of course, he doesn't know Yasuda isn't actually dead, but neither do we at this point, and reveals that's the reason he conspired with her fiancé, the Minister of Justice, to have her killed. He also, like Yasuda will do later with Logan, tries to spin it as doing her a favor. It's truly baffling why the dialogue would be concealed from non-Japanese speaking people in the theater. On DVD or Blu-ray, there's an odd subtitle function that gives you only the Japanese in these scenes where there are no subtitles, but not the English subtitles for the rest of the film. And I found a transcription of the script online that translates the Japanese portions into English, as though they were spoken that way all along. The dialogue in this scene is essential. It confirms that Shinjin has kind of lost it, that there's maybe a psychotic break at work, which he needs for me to buy he'd go as far as he does in trying to gain control of his father's corporation. It furthers the idea of power corrupting and consuming. Shinjin's obsession with monetary wealth and political control destroys him the way Yashida's obsession with immortality destroys him, and it puts these ideas in an X-Men context. Shinjin sees his daughter as genetically superior, interestingly not because she's a mutant, but because she has what he sees as natural gifts and traits that have robbed him of what he believes is rightfully his. I couldn't have picked up on any of that in the movie theater, which would have made it impossible to fully appreciate and interpret the story because I wasn't allowed to experience everything I was meant to. What makes it more frustrating is the few moments where two native Japanese characters will start speaking English to each other, and not in order to bring any English speakers into the loop, just so the audience knows what they're saying, and because it doesn't want to put subtitles on the screen. Why does Shinjin speak English to Yuriko earlier in the film when he takes her aside and tells her she's just a toy doll, a companion for a child who has outgrown her? But then this other vital exchange with Mariko later is in Japanese. But if the movie would, in any way at all, just give me all the story in the language I speak, it's really smart and well constructed. A lot of groundwork is laid early on for what's coming, and I feel like an idiot on a second viewing for not calling the big plot twist with Yashida at the end, which is as risky and grand a reveal as Ducard actually being Ra's al Ghul in Batman Begins. With the theme of the gift and curse of immortality permeating throughout, and Yashida's obvious eccentricity when we first meet him, the way he spins taking Logan's power for himself is doing him a favor, and the fact that really shortly after, Logan's healing factor slows to a crawl, on repeat viewings, it feels like the movie might as well have had a blimp fly over the screen, dragging a banner behind it that says, Yashida's still alive. And there's a massive clue immediately after Yashida appears to have died when Yukio, who gets flashes of how people are going to die and has up until this point never been wrong, says she didn't see it. The movie is so good at putting me in Logan's head, I was seeing everything from his outlook, and it never occurred to me to take Yukio's lack of vision as a clue that Yashida is still alive, maybe because Logan doesn't believe in what she can do. And later, because we discover she can be wrong. And there are enough factions coming after Logan and Mariko, seemingly all with their own agendas, it never occurs to me that there's anyone else involved. It's an unusual set of red herrings, because a lot of these players are involved in Yashida's grand plan in one way or another, even if they don't realize it. But none of them are the actual mastermind, and I'm not trying to figure out who's in charge. Logan begins playing detective about halfway through the film, and he learns the who's relatively quickly. It's the whys the film wants us to be asking about. Yashida's death looks like the occasion for story, and the narrative after the funeral centers around a power struggle, internally and externally, between members of the Yashida family, and between the Yashida company and the Yakuza. It's not a story about how a man's death affects the people around him. It's the story about the effect the man has on the people he manipulates in his quest to stay alive, versus the influence Logan has on the world at large as he wishes for death but lingers on, naturally cursed with the one thing Yashida is desperate for. So rather than a ruse masquerading as a first-act plot point, the real inciting incident is Yashida getting Logan to come to Japan through Yukio. For once in his life since Weapon X, Magneto would be wrong in chastising Logan for thinking everything centers around him. This time it absolutely does. Appropriate, since this is the first film starring Wolverine and the first film in the X-Men universe without X-Men in the title. If Logan had simply left well enough alone, like he tried to do in the first place, there would be no movie. Unless, of course, Yashida sent ninja bounty hunters or someone to abduct Logan when he finally found him. After all, I doubt if he would be content in the big robot suit that keeps him alive until he finally passes away, just because the man he's devoted his life to studying keeps refusing his invitation to Japan. Oh, well, my old war buddy won't get on an airplane, so I guess so much for immortality. I suppose it would be more accurate to say that would just be a very different movie, but I like how this situation forces Logan to face his never-ending moral dilemma head-on. When he gets involved, people get hurt because of him. When he doesn't get involved, people get hurt because he does nothing. Either way, innocent people die, and he has to live on with the memories of what he's done or what he's refused to do. It's the ultimate no good deed goes unpunished story. He makes a vow to Jean, who he sees in his dreams, not to hurt anyone else ever again. Not to be the Wolverine. But it's more complicated than just not killing while on his superhero adventures. A moral dilemma that has become the #1 most cliche and played out conflict in superhero stories in the last 10 years. Will the hero cross that line and go past the point of no return? Or, in the case of Arrow, will the hero decide to keep killing even though he's a bona fide murderer and goes back and forth on this 6 times a season? This scenario has become the equivalent of the old sitcom and soap opera will they or won't they bait, except a lot of superhero dramas go there too. This isn't a movie that forces a particular worldview on its protagonist or its viewer. It looks at who Logan is, what he's all about, and frames a story around his unique morality, and his human frailties and contradictions. We take the events on his terms, through his lens, and then we can decide how we feel about his ideals and his choices afterwards. Logan remains somewhat of an anti-hero, by most modern sensibilities. I wouldn't necessarily condone a guy like that taking the law into his own hands and deciding who should live and who should die. He may be a soldier, but he's not with any established army, and he has no official authority. Toward the beginning of the movie, when he snaps on the riffraff in the bar responsible for drugging a bear with a dart and leaving it to murder 5 people, he very consciously decides to throw away his vow and uncage his inner animal. Not because it's necessary, or because he's defending himself or anyone else in the moment, but simply because the dirtbag struck a nerve. Logan is a simple guy. He doesn't make the distinction between righteous killing and unnecessary killing. He goes with his God. Sometimes his motivations are more noble than others. He only slices people open who really deserve it, but he definitely does it for himself as much as anyone else, at least some of the time. Yukio steps in here and stops him, but she claims most of them are going to die in a car crash in a week, and he doesn't want them any less dead. And he is the same guy at the end he is here, only he's decided to become proactive again, because of the good he can do, rather than because of the revenge he wants. This is the story about a violent person who needs a reason to live and an outlet for his rage, not about a beast who becomes a kinder, gentler person. Logan doesn't feel guilty because he is killed. He feels guilty because he can't get close to anyone without their world catching on fire. Although, in Jean's case, she had that covered pretty well already. Logan certainly has compassion and empathy, but his death wish is all about himself. He isn't afraid people will die if he's alive, he's afraid of the pain he'll have to endure moving forward when they do. As Yukio repeatedly points out, Logan is a soldier. Soldiers kill, but they also protect. And that's why they kill. And with a purpose and guidance and self-discipline, that's primarily why Logan kills too. So his arc is about realizing that the risk of living and simply following his conscience is worth the reward. It's not a question of whether he should ever take lives. He's not having the Oliver Queen am I above the law dilemma. If Logan gets involved, and he thinks it's necessary, he's gonna impale people. The question for him is whether he should get involved in the first place. Whether the people he helps is worth the pain that inevitably comes from doing what he thinks is necessary. Wolverine is fascinating as a superhero because he walks that line between vengeance and justice so closely. Sometimes he's as much an anti-hero as the Punisher, a man you wouldn't often call a hero because he's just eliminating threats rather than fighting for justice. And sometimes he's closer to Batman. The only difference is Wolverine writers tend to put him in the impossible scenarios where the lesser of two evils is to kill and he's got no other way out. And Batman doesn't often face that scenario because exploring his philosophy on a serialized basis requires him to be able to avoid killing, even on accident. That's also easier to contrive with Batman because of his endless resources. Wolverine is all offense and no stealth. Logan lost in the wilderness is an animal off a leash, a dangerous man who reacts without thinking and is driven and controlled by his rage and revenge. But Logan the soldier is a hero who keeps that animal in check and fights with a burning and innate responsibility to help those in need. Never mind the consequences. The Logan at the end of the film, who is really Logan the X-Man, puts himself on the line and deals with the repercussions of doing what he thinks is right as they come. He lives in the now, as opposed to Yasuda, whose credo is keeping one eye on the past and one on the future. I think the two-handed sword is maybe representative of that idea, fully committed to the here and now, all in. It's important that Logan learn from the past, but he has to concern himself primarily with the present because despite his immortality, he can't control the future or his part in it until he gets there. Yukio says Logan wants what all soldiers want, a good death. A soldier could give his life at any moment, so he wants that death to count for something, or to survive to old age knowing he served his country until he was no longer useful, and then he can die, happy that he lived a full and purposeful life. Logan's sacrifice is arguably greater, to have to continue on living through the most difficult things to live through, as if he's been given a good death over and over, but forced to keep finding purpose. After meeting, saving, being saved by, and falling in love with a woman in Mariko who gives him reason to keep going, and who is dealing with a similar dilemma on a corporate level, and who I actually understand why he wants to be with beyond maximum hotness. And then seeing the monster Yasuda has become in his quest for the thing Logan has and most wishes he could lose, Logan comes to appreciate the gift he once saw only as a curse. Like so many natural-born leaders thrust into positions of power they don't want, Logan is worthy of his power because he understands the awesome responsibility that comes with it and isn't corrupted by it. Try as he might, he's incapable of turning a blind eye when someone is in trouble and he can help. Yasuda wants to live forever because he believes a life that never ends is the only life that can have any meaning, which has horrifying implications, especially if he's conveniently the only person that does live forever. That would make him not a god, but God, and he not only wants to continue on for all time, but he wants to be a master of all he surveys, evidenced by the empire he's built in the pursuit of Logan's power, and all the people he's hurt or corrupted in the name of his dark ambitions. Look at Harada and Viper, both symbols of what Logan might be if he didn't listen to his conscience and gave in to his baser instincts. Viper is the cold, emotionless animal who justifies her actions by saying it's just who she is. She's immune to all forms of poison, but also to human affection. We don't know anything about her background, really. Her mutation could tragically come with an antisocial personality disorder where she's literally incapable of feeling anything for other people. Or she might have decided at some point that that's a convenient excuse to use her abilities and take advantage of people, and she's been doing that so long she's lost any empathy she once had. If Logan gave in to his rage, he could get to a similar place too, and she appeals to that side of him when she tricks him into popping out his claws, so Yasuda can take his healing factor. She's interesting only on a symbolic level, but I like the idea that while Logan is embracing his nature, tempering it with compassion, Viper goes through a metamorphosis, changes her physical appearance, but never changes or grows emotionally. And Harada is the would-be hero with good intentions, who allows himself to be used for nefarious means because he adopts an ends-based outlook that's counter to Logan's ultimate do what's right despite how things turn out attitude. Like Logan in the Weapon X program, he lets himself be used as someone else's weapon and doesn't realize he's a pawn until it's too late. But Harada does some pretty deplorable things in the name of protecting Mariko, whom he loves and who once hoped in vain to be together with him because he thinks going along with Viper's plot is necessary to keep Mariko safe. He's pushed past his limit when he discovers that Yasuda is still alive and ends up paying the ultimate price for going along with the madness for so long. He ends up heroically giving his life for the woman he loves, getting what Logan thought he wanted when there's really no place left in the world for him. Harada is a lot more fully realized than Viper and is pretty sympathetic by the end. I also appreciate his character parallels with Logan because they inform why Mariko comes to fall so hard for Logan, a man who initially she doesn't want help from and shirks away from because she sees him as an almost mythic figure. Some of what Logan and Yasuda yearn for respectively is a grass is always greener outlook. Logan yearns for a normal life because he's never had one, and Yasuda yearns for an extraordinary life because he hated being normal and is only alive because of an extraordinary person who he would love to be. Whatever combination of environment, experience, and biology that led them there, these two men are fundamentally different in nature and worldview, which is demonstrated in their first fateful encounter at Nagasaki. Both men, at the time, are soldiers by position and profession, but only Logan is a soldier by nature. He can't help but try to rescue Yasuda after he suggests he stay in the well with him instead of standing on the surface when the bomb hits. And despite the fact that he's a POW. I don't mean to paint Logan as more noble and righteous than he is. He's constantly conflicted. He tries to go against his inner Jiminy Cricket a lot in favor of whatever will benefit him most. But after some hesitation, he'll almost always do the right thing eventually. His hesitation in this case cost several soldiers their lives, as Logan could have dragged most, if not all of them, back to the well with him, ahead of the mushroom cloud if he jumped out fast enough. But he waited until Yasuda's companions had already completed their honorable suicides. We get a clue to Yasuda's nature here. He can't bring himself to take his own life along with his companions. This doesn't make him the sociopath he'll turn into later, or even necessarily a coward. He's a guy on a battlefield who doesn't want to die, and I can absolutely sympathize. But he certainly doesn't have the heart of a soldier like Wolverine, who can't help but risk his own life to save Yasuda's. Even with the healing factor, Logan probably wouldn't have survived the full brunt of the blast, and his powers have to work overtime to keep him alive when the explosion gets to him in the well, as he protects Yasuda. Yes, this Wolverine is still overpowered compared to what he seemed to be capable of in the first two X-Men movies, but throughout the film, Mangold manages to keep the personal stakes high despite that. I mean, neither of them should be able to breathe the irradiated air when they come out of that hole, but I'll put that in the same conceit column as Logan even being able to remember any of this in the first place. It always feels like Logan's in danger when he's supposed to be, and not just when his powers are on the fritz. His healing factor isn't used as an easy out, with maybe the exception of his growing the bone claws at the end after Silver Yasuda Samurai slices off the metal claws. I love that image and the idea implicit there of nature triumphing over unfettered technology. It isn't that nature is good and science is bad. Wolverine giving in completely to his animal side is as scary as Yasuda giving in to his delusions of godhood. It's about tempering savagery and intellect with humility and empathy. So when the bone claws come out, that's Logan triumphing over mad science trying to control him, like it did with the Weapon X program. He won't let other men or his berserker rage tell him who he is. But as much as I like that image, it's not really something he should be able to do. We're still playing pretty fast and loose with the concept of healing versus spontaneous regeneration. Unless the bone claws were hiding under the metal claws all along, rather than the adamantium being poured over them. But I wouldn't think there'd be enough room for all that inside his arms, and I wouldn't think there would be enough room for a metal retractable mechanism to be housed next to a natural one made out of bone marrow. Pretty sure the healing factor just lets him instantly grow new bone claws, and that's not his power. He's not Deadpool. But I digress. Yasuda obviously doesn't care about a good death because he's mortified of death. He never comes to grips with his own limitations, as Logan interestingly does his. For Logan, not being able to die becomes a natural weakness he wishes to overcome in exactly the way inevitable mortality does for Yasuda. One of these men is meant to live longer than the average person and the other is not, and Yasuda starts to give up his humanity as he tries to play God, going against nature to give Logan what he thinks he wants in order to take what he wants. In Yasuda's mind, it's a win-win, or at least a convenient justification, to preserve his sense of honor by giving his friend and hero the gift of mortality, rather than stealing something, violating his friend because of his jealousy and his desperation. Which is, of course, what it really is. He doesn't give Logan a choice in the matter, and even when it's clear at the denouement that Logan has no desire to die, or at least that he still wants his healing factor, Yasuda is still spewing the same rhetoric. In the same breath, where he calls Logan's belief that a life lived too long can have no meaning a mistake, he still talks about ripping Logan's healing factor through his claw stubs like a favor. The peace you've always wanted. Your reward. I'm giving you the very death you longed for. The difference between the two men is that notion of a reward. After getting a new lease on life, Yasuda has created a legacy he believes must be preserved. He thinks he's entitled to immortality, that he deserves it. Logan finds it within himself to keep on, fighting against the pain that's still there, still represented by the anti-Jiminy Cricket voice in his head, Jean's voice, beckoning him to give up and let himself die, because he deserves an end to his pain, because he truly is a soldier. He fights for others, not for himself, as long as he can control his impulses. And he fights against whatever injustice he encounters in the moment, not as a mean to his own personal end. Young Yasuda tried to give Logan a sword in genuine gratitude for saving his life. But after that, everything he does is with an ulterior motive, Luthor-like. Yasuda idolizes Logan and puts him on a pedestal, even creates a fairy tale around him to tell his granddaughter at bedtime, casting him as the Kuzuri, a fierce animal with sharp claws that fears nothing. He admires Logan for the wrong reasons. What makes Logan worth looking up to is not a healing factor that makes him impervious to anything, even aging, so he has no reason to be afraid. It's what he does with that power. Yasuda doesn't understand the man at all, and if he tried to pattern his life based on Logan's example, instead of using all his resources to become Logan, he'd be a man who gives freely of himself for the sake of innocent people who need his help. When Logan doesn't do the right thing, It's because of his fear of losing the people he gets too attached to. Even his weaknesses are more human and selfless than Yasuda. Yes, Logan is sometimes more concerned with his own pain than he is with other people, but at least he cares about other people in the first place. Yasuda took only Logan's weaknesses and none of his strengths from that experience. He's motivated entirely by fear of dying and of being forgotten. Logan's pattern of violence revolves around getting involved in someone else's problems, helping a good and innocent person in the short run, but unintentionally creating a new and often larger problem that will come back to haunt them later in the process. As messy and convoluted as it became, the movie version of the Weapon X origin is even one of those. Logan volunteers for the program with the best of intentions, but ends up being taken advantage of when Stryker tries to control him and use him for his own destructive ends, against his will. In the first X-Men film, he saves Rogue from Sabretooth only to almost kill her himself accidentally because of his violent dreams of the Weapon X program. That same past comes back to haunt him in X2, when Stryker comes for the students at Xavier's school, and he's forced to kill the woman of his dreams in The Last Stand because it has to be done to save, well, the whole world, really. Although that one is less a bed he made and more of a bed he just always wished he could lie in. Mangold is doing the best he can with what he's got to work with here. Logan is a little like Batman in his approach to crime fighting, but his motivations are different. And again, he kills people. Comparing Jackman's Wolverine specifically to Bale's Batman, Logan is a guy who just wants to be left alone, but he has a specific moral code he lives by, sometimes despite himself. He doesn't really want to be a part of anything or inspire anyone, but his nature leads him to those outcomes naturally. Batman wants to be a symbol and set an example to be followed, and both have a dark side that could make them as dangerous as the villains they fight if they don't have an outlet for them. And they're partly driven by their fears, arguably healthy ones, of becoming monsters. So both of them put their ideologies before outcome, and both have to deal with the negative consequences of their actions, be it that escalation idea explored in The Dark Knight, with a bad guy who directly challenges the hero's example, or a legitimately inspired pupil as seen here, with Yasuda, a guy Logan wasn't trying to influence, just help, but who took the wrong lesson from the meeting and created a whole culture around his obsession. He was a good guy who just got lost in his own aspirations. He's sort of the Dark Knight Two-Face here. If he had died at Nagasaki, he would have been heralded a hero, but he lived long enough to see himself become the villain. Meanwhile, Logan keeps dancing on that edge, but ultimately catches himself before he goes so far he deserves bad guy status. And I should mention here, he gets pretty lucky he doesn't actually kill Mariko's scumbag, indirectly homicidal fiancé when he throws that guy out a window and doesn't know there's a swimming pool there, because that kill, like the guys in the bar at the beginning, would have been straight up revenge and nothing else. And every other time he takes a life, an argument can be made that it's a righteous kill. Both Batman and Logan create monsters in their heroic endeavors, and despite each going about it with different goals and motivations, they both wrestle with whether those endeavors are ultimately futile, given the extreme scale of negative response to their efforts. And I mean, like, morally justified, not righteous, like what Wayne from Wayne's World would call some of this spectacularly choreographed violence. I mean, a minister of justice who tries to off his own fiancée because she doesn't like him and won't have to marry him after she gets control of her grandfather's company, and conspiring with her own father, no less, probably deserves getting thrown out a window without a pool underneath. But it would still be straight up murder, and Mangold knows Logan's going to be less sympathetic, and we might not buy his starting back on the hero's path at the end if he turned Noburo into street pizza. On the other hand, Logan does seem to kill Yasuda purely out of vengeance at the end. He had him dead to rights, and he didn't have any more tricks up his giant mech robot sleeves. There was no real reason Logan had to kill him, but the circumstances here are bizarre and totally unprecedented. This is a guy in a suit designed to keep him alive. If he leaves it for too long, he's dead anyway. And why would it be fair to let him continue to live past his natural years over any other superly elderly person? I mean, you could give it to Violet Brown from Jamaica, who, at the time of this recording, is the oldest verified living person and 117 years old. She's not kidnapping mutants and stealing their healing factor through sawed-off bone claws, and she didn't break any laws to stay healthy. She seems like a really lovely, nice person. I'd take Silvermonger out of his stasis mech, let him live out his remaining hours on his weird Tempur-Pedic pincushion bed, and put Mrs. Brown in there. This guy's living on stolen time anyway. And then there's that real Hollywoody existential argument Mariko throws in that seems to clench Logan's decision to try out his new bone claws on his really old friend, that she buried her grandfather. Meaning this guy isn't really the man she respected and who cared more for her than her father. She either really does see him as a perversion or abomination of her grandfather, or she thinks it's okay for him to die because he should be gone. It's too hard for her to see him like this, and everybody thinks he's dead anyway. It's probably that second thing, because he clearly is the same person. He's not who she thought he was all along. But however you slice it, see what I did there? I don't think it's the same kind of righteous kill Logan performs in the moment when he's protecting himself for someone else. But it's also not exactly the same thing as throwing Minister Nabisco out the window without knowing if there's a pool. He's clearly getting some satisfaction out of Yashida's death. But Logan's also a somewhat morally ambiguous figure anyway. Even if he did that just to make himself and Mariko feel better, he's still really heroic relative to most of the figures in this story. And I buy it as something he would do. What I'm not totally clear on is whether the film expects me to take it as vengeful or heroic. I guess the real question I'm asking is, what would the Deadpool version of Colossus say to Wolverine right there just before he stabs Yoshida? Would he ramble on about the 4 or 5 moments life will give him to be a hero? Or I guess in his case 115? Or would he say, nah, he's a goner anyway, knock yourself out? I think one of the reasons Logan manages to get back on track and embrace the Wolverine again is because of the good consequences that came from the same spring the bad ones grew from. He became an unhealthy obsession for Yashida, but he also became a major influence on Yashida's granddaughter, Mariko. She wouldn't be the same woman if it weren't for Logan. She also wouldn't be alive if it weren't for him. And not just because he saved her, but because, Yashida had to exist to have children so that she could then be born. And she's someone Logan believably falls in love with and has a surprising amount in common with. Again, he has to decide if the positive outweighs the negative whenever he decides to get involved. If he did nothing in The Last Stand, Jean might still be alive, but a lot of people would be dead. Here, the stakes are more personal because I suppose the influence Yashida has on the entire culture of Japan, and by extension, the world, given that he's apparently the biggest technology innovator in Japan, and as Marty McFly said in Back to the Future Part 3, all the best stuff comes from Japan. Which, let's face it, is kinda as true now as it was back then. But I guess we can put technological progress in the plus column for reasons it was probably good that Logan saved that soldier at Nagasaki. Who knows what Yashida's legacy would have in store for the world once he's become immortal. But judging by the psychological scarring he's inflicted on his own son, and the fact that he nearly bankrupted his company in the pursuit of immortality, I imagine he would just grab for more power and happily step on or stab whoever he needed to get it. Besides that, what's most at stake for Logan is his and Mariko's futures. I like that the larger implications to all of this are unknown and aren't immediate. There's no swirling vortex of doom in the sky, no one's trying to destroy a city or the world to start anew and create paradise in the bones of thousands of victims, just a nutjob who wants to live forever and people whose lives are in ruins because of him. Like at Nagasaki, Logan has to do what he thinks is right in the moment, never mind what larger problems it might create later. And we'll never know what those issues might be because Logan is set well after this and doesn't deal with any of those events at all. But that uncertainty about the future he's created and that he's probably going to be around to see is really effective for this movie as a singular piece. In the here and now, Logan allows himself to get involved with a woman, while his inner fear is telling him, in the form of Jean Grey, that it can only end badly, and he finally gets that break he deserves. But not before he literally rips his own heart out of his chest for her. Not a final rest, that comes later, and there's still plenty of pain, physical and emotional, that comes with his pushing against what he wants to help Mariko. But the universe throws him a bone at the end, and he's earned it. He goes up against the Yakuza despite his busted healing factor, and Mangold does a great job of making it clear Logan isn't Riggs in Lethal Weapon, running into the line of fire because he has a death wish, but now trying to survive because he cares about a woman that's in trouble. And he jumps over every temptation and punishment for her. I'm rooting for him all the way because it's hard and because he's terrified that things will turn out the way they always do. And then the happy ending doesn't come off as sappy or convenient because Logan's life is far from perfect. He hasn't magically figured everything out, and the only thing that's really happy about it is that his girlfriend didn't die and he didn't have to kill her. They're still together at the end, even though he decides he can't physically stay there with her. And at least for now, he doesn't have to compete with a third wheel in a love triangle with shades and a warp-speed motorcycle. Mariko and Yukio both represent different sides to Logan's personality and his nature. Mariko is who Logan is right now, world-weary, directionless, and just ready for it all to end. They're both thrust into destinies they don't want but are perfectly suited for. Logan is a hero, and Mariko is a leader. Yasuda leaves her the family business, more perhaps because he thinks he can control her than because of those pesky genetic traits that skipped a generation, according to her father. But she does, nevertheless, get the company at the end, even though she doesn't want it, and embraces it just as Logan embraces his destiny. By the way, one of the best things about the movie is the distinction between fate and destiny. They can choose not to follow the clear paths their natures and their consciences put them on. That's destiny. But nothing is written in stone, as Logan proves when he goes against Yukio's prediction of his death and survives, despite having his heart in his hand. And again, at the end, when things don't turn out horribly for him and Mariko like he expected based on his past experiences. Logan and Mariko go on parallel character arcs and are well matched. While Yukio also reflects some of Logan's character traits, it's perfectly natural that he and Mariko should fall for each other rather than him and Yukio, as Yukio is in some ways too much like him. Though she's lost at the beginning, and seems to try to kill herself after she thinks Yasuda dies, but says later that's not what she wanted in Japanese dialogue you can't read without subtitles, and I'm not sure what that's about, but Mariko is the mature, good-natured to a fault, positive influence Logan really needs in his life. They challenge each other to embrace their respective duties and to continue on living. Contrastly, Yukio is the wild, free spirit Logan used to be, and wants to be the hero she thinks he should be. She's the mutant with a purpose, who uses her gift to help people because she's compelled. She was an unwanted street rat, like Logan, and has to prove that she's more than gutter trash. Shinjin calls her a toy doll, a plaything for a child who has outgrown her. Like Logan, she wants to be more than a thing to be used by someone else. She certainly doesn't think Mariko looks at her like a pet, but it is telling that she chooses to go with Logan rather than stay with Mariko to help her with the company at the end. That may just be because she thirsts for adventure and she doesn't need the comforts of the Yasuda family anymore. Maybe it's Yukio who has outgrown Mariko. But we don't get enough interplay between them, and that's a relationship that needs fleshed out. Yukio's ability to see future death is like Logan's ability to live forever. It's a curse first and a gift second. But unlike Logan, Yukio has accepted and embraced her power and seems comfortable with her role, not as child's plaything, but as guide to a hero. She desperately wants Wolverine to embrace his superhero role again. That's who she wants to be, too. Yes, she was sent by Yasuda as part of a sinister plot she was unaware of, and I wonder if she didn't hope just seeing the face of a man he saved all those years ago might inspire him to get back on the hero's path again. When Logan finally announces that he is the Wolverine, after telling her earlier, "That's not who I am anymore," and he takes down Yasuda, she gets on the plane with him, wide-eyed and ready for superheroing. She says she's his bodyguard, and of course, he doesn't need her backup like he did before when that Matrix bug glitched his powers out, but perhaps she thinks he's still emotionally fragile and could use some guidance, someone to guard him from his own impulses, a bodyguard for his spirit rather than his physical body. The biggest issue with that ending is that it does watch like a setup for a new status quo with Yukio as a sidekick, and I would have liked to have seen that dynamic in action. But by the mid-credit scene setting up Days of Future Past, he seems to have already ditched her, so who knows what became of that relationship. Maybe he went off on his own after the first place they decided to land, or maybe her precognition showed her the timeline soft reboot, and she saw the way Logan dies in Logan, couldn't reconcile it with the timeline she was in, went nuts, and ditched him. There's an alternate ending where Yukio gives Logan his classic yellow and brown costume in a suitcase on the airplane, and I think it's really unfortunate it didn't make it into the final version. Mangold apparently snuck it in after the movie was shot, and there's an Unleashed edition that puts it back in. Mangold's resistance to putting Logan in the full costume makes sense to me. He says Logan's not a narcissistic superhero and wouldn't feel the need to brand himself like that when he went into battle. I could see never having him actually wear it, but there were a lot of good reasons for the suit itself to show up where it would have in the movie, and I don't think it would have been too teasy never to see it again. Not only does the suit look fantastic, at least crumpled up in a box, we don't get to see Jackman wear it, and not only would it have been applaud-worthy fan service, but it would have been totally earned and not remotely gratuitous fan service. Especially in a movie that, with the exception of the really over-the-top super comic booky Viper, doesn't really feel like a superhero movie. It's the perfect coda to Logan's character arc and symbolizes the journey he's been on. Yukio tells him all movie that he's a soldier, and after he's embraced his true nature, she gives him, at long last, a uniform. That's a great thematic beat to end on, even if he never agreed to put it on. Not to mention that it would have been really neat to get the costume in a solo Wolverine movie without X-Men in the title. It felt in the theater like something was missing with that ending, like it really struggled to leave off with a memorable idea or image, and man is it disappointing to know it had one and dropped it. The Wolverine is one of those movies I know is good while I'm watching it, but doesn't approach greatness until I start thinking and writing about it. It's easily dismissed as the Wolverine movie we needed, but not necessarily the one we deserved. But now was not the time for Logan. That came later. It's not just about making us care about Wolverine again. It's a thought-provoking meditation on just what it would be like to be immortal, and gives me a new appreciation and respect for my own mortality. It's also a film that lives and breathes, has an immense respect for both the nature in and the culture of Japan, and yet is organically infused with plenty of thrilling action. That bullet train sequence is one of the most impressive fights I've seen in a superhero movie, and finally gives Logan a reason to do that previously unintentionally hilarious leap that's all over Origins. On the Blu-ray special features, Hugh Jackman says that when he's 80 and people ask him which of these movies people should watch, he'll say it's this one. Now that he's bowed out, he swears, with his final curtain call in Logan, that's almost certainly not what he'd say now. But there's a very different, elegant, introspective piece here I think we needed before we were really ready for Logan, and it's an exploratory surgery James Mangold had to do before he could make that movie. It's an overall excellent and truly unique entry in the genre that I hope doesn't get lost in time. I'm giving The Wolverine a 3.5 out of 4.